At its peak, Kodak controlled 90% of American film and 85% of American cameras. The phrase, "a Kodak moment," entered the English language and never left. It described something worth preserving, something real, something you would want to remember. On January 19, 2012, Kodak filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. 130 years of American industrial history reorganized in a Delaware courtroom. The sharpest detail is not the bankruptcy. It is this: Kodak invented the digital camera in 1975. They understood exactly what it would do. They chose to bury it anyway. This is the story of a company that saw the future first and flinched. The founder and the invention of everyday photography. In 1878, George Eastman was a bank clerk in Rochester, New York, who had recently become obsessed with photography. Photography at that moment was not a hobby. It was an expedition. A wet plate camera required a portable darkroom, 12 pounds of equipment, and a working knowledge of chemistry that most people did not have and did not want. Eastman looked at all of that and saw not artistry, but friction. Unnecessary, solvable friction. He spent 3 years developing a dry plate process that eliminated the portable darkroom entirely. Then he went further. He replaced glass plates with a flexible paper-backed film that could be loaded in daylight. Then further still. He designed a camera small enough to hold in 2 hands, loaded it with his film, and wrote a tagline that became one of the most consequential sentences in American commercial history. "You press the button. We do the rest." For the first time, ordinary families could document their own lives. Eastman had not invented photography. He had democratized memory. Those are not the same achievements, and only one of them builds an empire, the Rochester Empire. By the 1970s, Kodak was not simply a company in Rochester. It was the condition Rochester existed inside of. 60,000 people in a single American city worked for the same employer. Kodak built the hospital where their children were born, funded the concert hall where the symphony played, and maintained the parks where families spent their Sundays. The city and the corporation had grown so intertwined that distinguishing between civic infrastructure and corporate generosity had become genuinely difficult. Inside that dominance was a financial engine of extraordinary efficiency. Film cost very little to manufacture and sold at margins that most industries would find difficult to believe. A roll of Kodachrome that retailed for a few dollars returned profit that funded laboratories, lobbying, and an entire architecture of corporate permanence. Kodak held 90% of American film market share and 85% of camera sales. Those are not competitive numbers. They are the numbers of a company that has stopped competing and started simply existing. The danger was not visible from inside. It rarely is. Monopolies do not feel like vulnerabilities. They feel like facts. The invention they buried in 1975, a 24-year-old Kodak engineer named Stephen Sasson built something in a Rochester laboratory that had never existed before. It weighed 8 pounds. It captured a black and white image at 0.01 megapixels. It took 23 seconds to save a single photograph to a cassette tape. By every practical measure, it was primitive, inconvenient, and commercially useless. It was also the first digital camera ever made, and Sasson had built it entirely from Kodak components, on Kodak time, inside Kodak's own facilities. He brought it to his managers. He demonstrated what it could do. He showed them, with reasonable clarity, where the technology would eventually go. The response from the executives in the room was not hostility. It was something more dangerous. It was polite and considered dismissal. The question they asked was simple. Who would want to look at photographs on a television screen? The underlying calculation was simpler still. Film represented 70% of Kodak's profits. Digital would not add to that number, it would replace it. The patent was filed. The project was shelved. Sasson returned to his desk. The Polaroid War and the missed signal. In the 1970s, the competitive threat that Kodak took most seriously was not digital. It was a Polaroid. Edwin Land's instant cameras produced a developed photograph in 60 seconds, without a darkroom, without a lab, without sending anything anywhere. For a company whose entire business model depended on film processing revenue, instant photography was a direct attack on the margin structure that funded everything else. Kodak responded the way large companies respond when they feel genuinely threatened. They spent a decade and $1.5 billion developing their own instant film camera system to compete directly with Polaroid in the market Polaroid had invented. In 1986, a federal court ruled that Kodak had infringed on 10 of Polaroid's patents. The settlement came to $925 million. Kodak was ordered to recall 16 million cameras and exit the instant photography market entirely. The financial cost was significant. The strategic cost was larger. An entire decade of engineering attention, executive focus, and capital allocation had been spent fighting a competitor in a format that the market was already beginning to leave. While Kodak litigated the present, Japan was quietly building the future. The Japanese camera industry and the slow erosion Canon, Nikon, and Fujifilm did not arrive suddenly. They arrived the way erosion arrives, consistently, incrementally, and without announcing themselves until the damage was already done. Through the 1970s and 1980s, Japanese manufacturers built cameras with superior optics, more reliable mechanisms, and price points that Kodak's American production costs could not match without sacrificing the margins that Wall Street had come to expect. Fujifilm pursued Kodak's film business with particular aggression, pricing their product below Kodak's and accepting thinner margins in exchange for shelf space. The signal that should have ended the debate came in 1984. The Los Angeles Olympics, American soil, American audience, the most photographed event in the world that year. Fujifilm outbid Kodak for the official sponsorship. A Japanese film company bought the naming rights to America's home games, and Kodak let it happen. Kodak's response to each year of erosion followed the same pattern: cut costs, increase the marketing budget, defend the existing model. The strategy was not unintelligent. It was simply aimed at a problem that was no longer the actual problem. The layoffs and the unraveling of Rochester. In 1988, Kodak employed 145,000 people worldwide. The number felt permanent the way all large numbers feel permanent until they begin to move. The cuts started in 1989, then again in 1993, then 1997, then 2004. Each round was announced as the restructuring that would stabilize the business, the difficult but necessary correction that would position Kodak for the next chapter. Each round was followed, within a few years, by another round. By 2011, fewer than 20,000 people remained on the global payroll. In Rochester specifically, the contraction was not just an employment statistic. It was a geographic transformation. Factories closed. The Kodak Park campus, once a self-contained industrial city of 35 buildings and its own power plant, began emptying floor by floor. The hospital Kodak built still stood. The concert hall still hosted performances. The name remained on the buildings, but the buildings were no longer full, and the name on them was beginning to describe a history rather than a present tense. Rochester had built its identity around a single employer, across 4 generations. That is not a civic strategy. It is a civic faith. And faith, when the institution it is placed in begins to fail, has nowhere to go. The patent war, the last weapon, by 2010, Kodak's most valuable asset was not a camera. It was not a roll of film. It was a portfolio of 1,100 digital imaging patents that covered foundational processes embedded in nearly every smartphone camera operating in the world. The company that had invented digital photography in 1975 and declined to build a business from it had nonetheless retained the intellectual property. Those patents, filed and shelved across 3 decades of defensive innovation, were now worth more than everything Kodak manufactured. Kodak began filing litigation against Apple, HTC, and Samsung, claiming infringement on patents covering image preview technology, image capture methods, and digital sharing processes. The lawsuits generated headlines and, in some cases, settlements. Apple paid, others negotiated. The spectacle carried its own commentary. The company that invented the technology underlying a trillion-dollar global industry was not participating in that industry as a manufacturer or an innovator. It was participating as a plaintiff. A company that fights with patents instead of products has already lost the argument that matters. It has simply found a way to lose more slowly. The bankruptcy and the aftermath on January 19, 2012, Eastman Kodak Company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the Southern District of New York, 130 years after George Eastman's first patent application, 64 years after Kodak introduced the first consumer color film, 37 years after Stephen Sasson built a digital camera in a Rochester laboratory and was told to put it away. The patent portfolio, the last genuinely valuable asset the company held, was sold to a consortium that included Apple, Google, and Microsoft for $525 million. The companies that had been sued for building an industry on Kodak's foundational technology paid $500 million for the right to stop being sued. Kodak emerged from bankruptcy in 2013. The company that survived was not the company that had entered. It was redirected toward commercial printing and packaging, sectors with no cultural resonance and no nostalgic constituency, but with actual margins and actual demand. The yellow film boxes are still produced in small runs for photographers who choose analog deliberately. They are a niche product sold to people who remember what Kodak was. That is not a business, it is a memorial. Epilogue and closing aphorisms. Kodak still exists. The name is still registered. The headquarters building in Rochester still carries it above the entrance. The company that operates beneath that name makes commercial printing plates, packaging materials, and motion picture film for a Hollywood that still shoots on celluloid out of aesthetic preference rather than necessity. It is a functional business with a rational balance sheet and no particular connection to the company that taught the world to photograph itself. Stephen Sasson, the engineer who built the first digital camera in 1975, retired from Kodak in 2009. He received the National Medal of Technology and Innovation from President Obama in 2009. The camera he built is in the Smithsonian. The company he built it for filed for bankruptcy 3 years after he left. George Eastman's original insight was precise and simple. Make memory accessible. Remove the friction between a moment and its preservation. That insight built an empire. Somewhere between the film margins and the patent lawsuits and the 4 CEOs and the $500 million spent on a dead analog format, the company forgot what the insight had actually been about. Inventing the future and profiting from it are 2 entirely different skills. Kodak didn't fail to see digital coming. It failed to want it to. A monopoly is not a business model. It is a postponed reckoning. The camera that destroyed Kodak was built inside Kodak. They just never let it out.